Hello, it's time for another book tasting. I'm Miss Gina and I'll be reading The Windeby Puzzle by Lois Lowry. This is a made-up story based on a real 2,000-year-old body that was discovered in a bog in northern Germany, and it's the body of a young person. So Lois Lowry made up this story based partly on the actual history and partly on her own imagining. So we'll start with a small section of the history and then we'll jump ahead to a small section of the fictional story. Also, there will be pictures of bog bodies, but I will show those at the end in case you don't want to see them. Hold it! Stop the engine! The heavy machinery fell silent. The operator peered down from the cab. Why? What's wrong? Look! We pulled up a leg! Holy! The workers fell silent. They stared at the thing dangling from the metal digging claw. Think it's from a stag? One asked, finally. But they all knew it wasn't an animal's leg. It was human. It was May 1952, on an estate called Windeby in northern Germany. Workmen using modern cutting equipment were removing peat from a small bog the day that one of them saw what he thought at first was a large animal bone. It wasn't. It was a human lower leg, and they quickly discovered that their machinery had also brought up a foot and a hand. Thinking they had unearthed a crime scene, they turned off their equipment and summoned the police. A museum curator and his assistants also rushed to the scene. After an examination of what had been found almost 5 feet below the surface of the bog, they explained to the police that this was not an unsolved murder. At least, not in the usual sense. These body parts, scientists eventually determined, were around 2,000 years old, from the 1st century AD, the time now known as the Iron Age. The workmen had uncovered what was known as a bog body, which means just that, a body found buried in a peat bog. Hundreds of them have been discovered over the last 2 centuries. The oldest is a Danish woman known to anthropologists as Kolbjerg woman, who died around 8000 BC. Peat is a curious substance. It is created in wetlands where vegetation, plants, grasses, moss, never fully decays because of a high acid content. This organic, semi-decayed material, peat, builds up over centuries to become a thick, mucky, and waterlogged swamp, or bog. Harvested, compressed, and dried, peat has been used as fuel for countless years. It still is in some places. In earlier days, chunks of peat were dug by hand using spades, then dried and piled beside primitive farmhouses. More recently, sophisticated mechanical equipment does the same job of cutting and compressing the substance. Today, you can find peat moss, a substance harvested from peat, for sale in garden centers along with fertilizer and compost. Adding it to your garden will help the soil retain moisture. At night, in a peat bog, gases produced by the bog materials ignite when they encounter oxygen, creating flickering lights that scientists call bioluminescence. Not surprisingly, folklore and ghost stories sometimes portray the phenomena as sinister spirits beckoning to travelers. No question, peat bogs are spooky, sometimes dangerous places. And as the German peat cutters discovered in 1952, they contain secrets. Estrild's story. The Warrior's Knot. Cool wind, day start. One bird a-twitter. Warblers newly back now, settling in after winter in a warmer place. Planting time soon. Then the birds would be everywhere, noisy, pecking for the seeds, for the insects. Eggs in the nests, speckled eggs they were, the warblers' nests in the high grasses. Dark still. But the land was alive, waking, whistling with breeze through the grasses and murmuring with creatures emerging from sleep. The ox in his nearby pen snorted and shifted his weight. An owl high up, aware of rabbits scampering back to their burrows, gave a breathy, repetitive hoot. Estrild, standing just outside the doorway, shivered, wrapped her shawl around her, and fastened it with a peeled thorn. When she had time, there was a laugh, whoever had time. There were always the chores. But when she could, on a stormy day perhaps, she would try to smooth and polish the small, bony skeleton of a bird she had hidden away. She had a plan to make it into a clasp to hold her shawl edges tight. A woman in the village had such a clasp. Estrild had noticed it during the autumn ceremonies. The druids intoned their spells, the men thumped their spears into the ground, chanting, and the women watched from the edge, jiggling the babies and murmuring soothing sounds to quiet the hungry whimpers. Through it all, from her place standing on the edge, Estreld had noticed the tall, red-haired woman, had studied the curved brooch, measuring how a sharpened piece of bone thrust through the woven cloth, in and then out, held the fringed edges of fabric together and made a sort of decoration. Not that she wanted decoration, but she liked the idea of the little skeleton, the remains of a creature taking on a new role, reminding one that it had existed. Usually dead things, even people, crumbled and rotted away and were forgotten. For now, though, for holding the borders of her shawl tight, the jagged thorn would do. Estreld adjusted the fastening securely. She rubbed her hands together to warm them, moved away from the dooryard, and felt her way along the darkened path that divided dwellings one from another. She headed toward the edge of the small village. "Estreld!" The voice came, a hoarse whisper, from the entranceway of the shadowed storage shed behind the iron forger's hut. The hut was a separate structure, apart from the village dwellings, alone in its patch of land. The forger used fire. All dwellings had a fire for warmth and cooking, but the iron forger especially kept his ablaze and flaring. He made sparks, hammering at pieces of iron, shaping tools and spears and shields. His forge was set apart for safety. They all feared fire. Their dwellings were built of twigs and sticks and thatch. Whole villages had been destroyed in the past by flames. So the forger's hut was separate, and the flaming bits that were sometimes thrown loose landed in dirt and died there. Hearing the husky voice, the girl peered over through the shadows and laughed. "Varick," she said. "Good, you remembered. No need to hide. Everyone is asleep still. Come on out." A thin boy with long, unkempt hair emerged from the shed. He was older than Estreld, but less healthy. He was hunched over, and his bones showed, elbows knobby, and his ribs laddering his chest behind a ragged open vest. He nodded a greeting and followed her along the wide dirt lane. He walked awkwardly. His back was crooked, and it made his gait uneven. He lurched. Sometimes she had seen him lean on a stick, but this morning he had left his stick behind because, with both hands, he carried something that glistened in the dim pre-dawn. "You still look like a boy," he said to her suddenly. She peered through the darkness to look at him. "I know that," she told him. "Not too long, though, and you'll be womanly." "I know that, too." "Just thinking that now's the time you can do this." "Yes, I've been planning it for a long time, been yearning for it, but when I was younger I was too scared and too small. If I don't do it now, though, it will be too late." She turned off the lane into a narrow path bordered by tall grass. "Come this way," she said, and waited to be certain he was following. "I have a place in mind, near the place where you showed me the bird skeleton once, remember?" "You still have it?" he asked. She nodded, yes. She had become friends with the odd, solitary boy when she was young. She had often observed him doing his chores at the forge or greeted him as they both waited in line for water from the village well. One afternoon, on a meadow path, she had come across him hunched over the remains of a dead bird, something most people would kick aside. Varick, though, had held it cupped in his dirty hand, and when she stopped to look, he explained the parts to her, how the bones worked, how complicated even the smallest creature was. He studied such things, he had told her, even bugs and worms. It was his secret, he had said. And so, eventually, she had shared her own secret with the boy, the longing that consumed her, the thing that had brought her here this dawn. "How old are you?" she asked, as they went forward into the meadow. Estreld was familiar with such details about most of her friends in the village, but this friendship was private, unshared, and she knew nothing of the boy's history. "Not sure." "Why don't you know?" "My mother died when I was born, so nobody kept watch of my age." "Who fed you?" "My father gave me to a neighbor to tend. He paid her coins so she'd feed me, but after he was gone, there were no more coins, so she put me out." "Where did your father go?" "He died in battle. My father was a warrior." Through the shadows, she could see Varick hold himself straighter, signaling his pride. It was worthy of pride to have a warrior in the family, though to lose a warrior in battle was too frequent a thing. Estrild was still washed with grief when she remembered her mother's younger brother, Erhard, her beloved uncle, killed by a spear thrust just last year in a skirmish over rulership of nearby land. They said, afterward, that Erhard had led a charge across the field, had called his battle cry in a loud and fearless voice. In the midst of it, one of his fellow warriors had been struck by an arrow. Erhard had paused to give him aid, had crouched in a moment of kindness to help his friend, and was lost when an enemy warrior on horseback galloped past with his spear. Estrild remembered how Erhard's blue eyes had crinkled with amusement as he had tickled and teased her just days before that battle, how the villagers had cheered him and his fellow warriors as they marched off to warfare with their spears thumping the ground in rhythm. And she could still see in her memory her uncle's blood-smeared face, and how his death-stopped eyes had stared unseeing at the sky as they carried him, splayed atop his shield, up the path a week later. The tribes, so many of them scattered across these hillsides, had vied throughout history. The bards sang of warfare centuries past in those sung tales. The warriors of the earlier times were often aided by gods, who came to earth and took sides. Now the deities remained distant, though the druids still intoned prayers before battles, asking for their help. "What did you do after your father died?" she asked Varric. The boy shrugged. "Grabbed what I could, here and there." Her own life, Estrild thought, was hard, with all the chores and the constant help her mother needed with so many little ones. But Varric's had been so much harder. He'd worked just to survive, and it seemed that he'd barely made it. No wonder he was so thin. His breath came hard as he limped beside her. "I can carry that," she told him, and reached over to try to lighten his burden. "You take this one," he said, and handed her one of the gleaming objects. "Other one's for me, to show you how." He handed her a large circular shield. In the dim light, she ran her fingers over the hammered pattern. "It's not done yet," Varric explained. "He's still working on it." "Who will it go to?" "One of the new warriors. He'll have it at the ceremony." The ceremony. That was the time she was waiting for, working toward, and it would be soon. "We have time, don't we, before the ceremony, for you to teach me? How long do you think it will take?" Varric sighed, and she fell silent. He was willing to teach her, but she knew he thought her plan foolish. More than foolish, dangerous. And perhaps it was, but she felt stirred to try. Maybe it was a need for vengeance, for Erhard, the uncle she had loved. And now that she knew of him, for Varric's father, who had fallen in battle and left an orphaned son. Women should not let such losses go unanswered. But more than that, her longing had begun with observing her mother. Estrild had watched her mother day after day with a feeling that grew stronger each year, the feeling that life should hold more for a woman. She could remember a time, perhaps 6 or 7 summers before, when her mother had been strong, had run laughing with her in the meadow where their horse was pastured, had lifted her to the horse's back and sprung easily up behind her, had grabbed the thick mane and galloped with her as the wind caught their hair and their voices. But laughter had long ago left their dwelling. Her mother, once so lively, was stooped now, the skin on her face hardened into lines, and her fingers were gnarled at the joints. A potion made from willow bark eased the pain of them, but it came back threefold each time the weather turned damp. The same had happened, was happening still, to the other village wives and mothers. At the ceremonies and festivals, it was always the boys and men who were cheered and celebrated, never the women. Watching them, Estrild had begun to feel a passion to become more than just another wife, one more woman made gaunt from chores and childbearing, old before her time. Women deserved more. All right, that's it for our little sampling of the Windeby Puzzle. If you'd like to find out what happens next to Estrild and Varric, come check out the book at your library. All right, and now as promised, a picture of the bog body. So this is the body known as the Windeby girl. And this is a picture of part of a shield that the one in the book is based on a little bit.